Over the course of a millennium, an estimated 11 million Africans were forcibly displaced from their homes, marched across deserts, or shipped across oceans to serve in foreign lands. When we talk about the history of human bondage, we typically picture places exactly like this: the massive stone fortresses along the West African coast, built to funnel captives into the transatlantic slave trade. But this traditional wooden sailing vessel, known as a dhow, represents a completely different geographic network. These ships ferried captives across the Indian Ocean, while heavily guarded caravans marched millions more across the grueling sands of the Sahara. Looking at this timeline, the chronological gap is staggering. The transatlantic trade operated for roughly 4 centuries. The Arab slave trade began a full 1,000 years earlier and continued operating for nearly a century after the last ships crossed the Atlantic. How does a human displacement of this scale, running for triple the amount of time, remain almost completely absent from our global historical consciousness? In the West, historical research has heavily prioritized the Americas. Scholars and historians have spent decades dissecting the plantation economies of the New World, driven largely by the need to understand and reckon with the deep racial legacy of European and American participation. In the Arab world, a different dynamic took hold. Because the practice of slavery received early sanction in religious texts and Islamic law, it rarely faced a widespread moral challenge from within the society itself. It was accepted as a natural part of the social order. These two independent blind spots meant that for centuries, millions of people were effectively written out of the narrative, as neither tradition felt compelled to shine a light on the practice. To track this history, we have to look past the familiar plantation model and explore a system governed by a different set of social and legal priorities. Under Islamic law, or Sharia, there were strict conditions regarding who could be subjected to bondage. You could not legally enslave a fellow Muslim. The primary legal avenue for capturing humans was through the jihad, or holy war, meaning only non-believers taken during these specific conflicts could be enslaved. But pure profit frequently trumped religious doctrine. Slave raiders regularly bypassed these legal safeguards, specifically targeting Black African Muslims and inventing arbitrary religious pretexts to justify capturing and selling them anyway. Once sold, their lives looked very different from those sent to the Americas. Instead of building an industrial agricultural machine, Arab society acquired enslaved people primarily as status symbols. They were absorbed into private households as domestic servants, conscripted into armies, or placed in sprawling harems. There were, however, brutal geographical exceptions. In this image, we see enslaved workers processing clothes on the East African island of Zanzibar. Here, the labor model closely mirrored Western plantations, with thousands of captives forced to clear land and harvest cash crops under the threat of the overseer's whip. This specific agricultural boom was industrialized by the Omani Arab elite. Sayed Said, the Sultan of Zanzibar pictured here, actually relocated his entire royal court from Oman to the island in the 19th century, specifically to capitalize on the highly profitable global market for clothes. Yet, despite these localized agricultural operations, the broader Arab slave trade operated on an entirely different economic logic. Its primary utility remained deeply social and domestic. This relatively mild treatment created an unintended trap. By softening the sharpest edges of human bondage, the society avoided the severe moral friction that might have triggered an abolitionist movement. The system became normalized and consequently managed to survive for 1,400 years. The 11 million people sent to the Middle East have left almost no equivalent presence. Looking at this demographic split, we see the reason why. The Arab market placed a much higher premium on female captives. In urban centers, enslaved women outnumbered men by a ratio of 3 to 1, commanding significantly higher prices. These women were frequently purchased to serve as concubines. Under the law, if an enslaved woman had a child recognized by her free Arab master, that child immediately inherited the father's free status and legitimate standing within the family. As these legitimate, free-born children grew up, they married into the broader society. Over centuries, this created a continuous blending effect, altering the racial and social makeup of subsequent generations. Instead of passing down an enslaved status for lifetimes, The legal structures of concubinage and inheritance systematically absorbed the descendants of captives. They effectively bred a distinct enslaved class out of existence. This absorption was accelerated by sheer attrition. Enslaved populations faced high mortality rates on the grueling desert and ocean journeys. Once settled, fertility rates among enslaved women remained low, while individual acts of manumission constantly chipped away at the total captive population. When the practice finally ended, it did not happen through an internal moral awakening. This 1808 document marks the British abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, an act which sparked a long campaign of Western naval blockades and geopolitical pressure. It was this external force that eventually compelled the Arab world to abandon its own networks in the 19th and 20th centuries. Because the descendants of the Arab trade had assimilated so seamlessly into the dominant culture, their specific origins became virtually untraceable. There was no segregated, unified community left behind to demand that their ancestors' stories be remembered or taught. In the West, the plantation system left a stark legacy of physical and economic segregation, but in the East, as we see in the shadow of this modern tower, the remnants of the Dhow trade dissolved into modern society. When we define human exploitation solely through the transatlantic plantation model, we miss a massive piece of the global picture. We allow 11 million lives and a full millennium of history to slip quietly out of our memory.